Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Wyenberg. This time we will continue with our reading of Over the Gate by Miss Reed. Chapter 8, Mrs. Pringle's Christmas Pudding. One of the pleasures of school holidays is the opportunity to join in village affairs more fully than is possible in term time. When I was asked if I would help the Women's Institute to prepare for a party, I agreed with alacrity. Once a year, the members of Fairacre WI invite a coachload of Londoners for the afternoon. Many of the visitors were evacuated to this area from the East End during the last war. Some had their schooling during the war years at our village school. Their mothers, now elderly women, lived in our midst, made friends, worshipped at St. Patrick's, shared our pains and pleasures, and generally forged bonds which will last a lifetime. It is always a gay afternoon, with much reminiscing about shared memories and much gossip about new babies, marriages, good fortune and bad, which have been experienced since the last meeting. The visitors were due to arrive at 2 o'clock. The custom is to greet them at the village hall with the tea urns ready. The main tea, a gargantuan meal, is prepared for 5 o'clock, but the 2 o'clock cup is considered the right welcome after their long trip from London and their lunch stop on the way. At one time, we used to prepare our offerings in our own kitchens, converge upon the village hall about 2, and deposit sandwiches, sausage rolls, cakes, and so on upon the dishes provided for the main meal. Anyone who organizes these things knows the result would be chaotic. 4 people who had offered sausage rolls would decide to provide chocolate sponge instead. The 6 who had promised sandwiches found that the local baker had no sliced bread, and so had opted to provide rock cakes instead, and the carefully prepared lists pinned up in the hall became covered with indescribable scribblings as the 2 people in charge tried to sort out the muddle. After a few years of such crises, it was decided to leave the matter in the hands of the committee, ably headed by Mrs. Partridge, the vicar's wife, who is our president. These noble and efficient ladies ordered the bread, butter, and fillings for the sandwiches and every other necessity, and detailed squads of underlings to prepare the food under their vigilant surveillance in the hall. It worked much better that way, we found. Consequently, at 10 o'clock on the morning of the great day, I made my way to the rendezvous, carrying my basket with a knife for buttering, a knife for cutting bread, and some tea and sugar as my foolproof contribution to the festivities. The hall was buzzing like a beehive when I entered. The card tables, which are used for local whist drives, had been placed at intervals round the hall and covered with bright cloths ready for the visitors. At one end, 2 long trestle tables were the scene of much activity. Here the noise was at its greatest, for about 20 women cut and buttered bread, wielded salt and pepper pots, stacked sandwiches, arranged cakes on plates, and generally made as much hubbub as my own schoolchildren. I joined the throng and found myself between Mrs. Maughan and Mrs. Willett. Mrs. Maughan has lived in Fairacre only a year or 2, and is the wife of our local ornithologist. His other claim to fame is his wonderful grasp of the church accounts, which used to drive the vicar to distraction before Mr. Maughan's coming. Mrs. Maughan has the happy knack of upsetting everyone in the village by much forthright and tactless comment. Her remark about the general incompetence and probable dishonesty of the clergy in money matters, spoken directly to the vicar's wife in the presence of several speechless parishioners, has long been remembered. However, as we all have to live cheek by jowl in the village here, we push such memories to the back of our minds as best we may and get on with day-to-day living. Mrs. Willett, the wife of our school caretaker, is a small mouse-like creature who looks meek and frail. In fact, she is a dynamic person who gets through more work in 24 hours than I do in a week. Her washing line on a Monday morning flies a multiplicity of spotless linen long before her neighbors have pegged theirs out. Her store cupboards bulge with jams, jellies, pickles, and chutneys of her own making. Puddings and pies, batches of scones, roast joints, and 1,000 other delicacies stream from her oven to nourish sturdy Mr. Willett 3 times a day. Besides this, she makes her own clothes, sings in St. Patrick's choir, enters all the WI competitions, knits, crochets, makes rugs, and generally leaves one feeling quite useless and incorrigibly lazy. Now her hands flew briskly back and forth from potted meat to bread and butter, working at twice the pace and with twice the deftness of my own. Mrs. Willett's sandwiches were models of square exactitude. Mine gradually grew more and more rhomboid as the loaf went down. Mrs. Willett's crusts sliced away cleanly. Mine broke away raggedly, despite my best endeavors. The only comfort was that Mrs. Maugham's were, if anything, rather more dilapidated than mine. We shouted amiably to each other among the din. "The new people are moving in," Mrs. Willett told me. "The Blundells. I knew her as a girl. Very pretty she was then." I remembered Amy's story and waited for more. Mrs. Maugham added her contribution with her usual tact. "Looks rather a rackety type now," was her comment. "Hair very obviously dyed, and in trade, I hear." Mrs. Willett began to bridle. "A very flourishing business in Caxley," I put in placatingly. If trade is flourishing enough, I notice, there seems to be less antagonism toward it. Mrs. Maugham, however, was not particularly moved. She sucked a buttery finger and continued to arrange her sandwiches. It would have made a sanitary inspector's hair curl, but we are tough in Fairacre, and one of our favorite maxims is, "You have to eat a peck of dirt before you die," which we quote as we sketchily dust the tomato that has rolled on the floor, or take in the loaf that has been lodged outside on the window-sill. "I shan't bother to call," said Mrs. Maugham, filching my bread knife shamelessly and making the handle horribly buttery. Mrs. Willett muttered something which sounded like "fat lot she'll care," but was unheard by Mrs. Maugham. Mrs. Willett's neck was growing rosy with suppressed anger, and feeling rather nervous with so many knives flashing around, I attempted to be a little peacemaker once more. "I believe Mrs. Blundell used to sing very well," I began. "Oh, she sung lovely," replied Mrs. Willett with enthusiasm. "Used to come out here with the operatic during the war, and we had rare old times." She gazed round our dingy village hall with affection. The walls are covered with sticky, gingery brown matching board, and upon its surface hang lopsided photographs of football teams of long ago, faded brown with age. Stern country countenances, many of them wearing fine mustaches, peer from among the clouds which the damp has drawn over the group. Here and there are pinned such notices as "Scouts' Rules," "Resuscitation of the Drowned," though we are miles from water, and "Suggestions for WI Program, Please Help." By the door there is a dilapidated piece of cardboard on which is printed, "Please switch of the light." And that missing F has been a thorn in my flesh ever since coming to Fairacre. Dusty plush curtains on a sagging wire screen the minute stage from sight, and the floor is of splintery bare boards with here and there a knot of wood, polished by friction, projecting like a buttered brazel. There is nothing truthfully to gladden the eye in our hall, and yet Mrs. Willett looked upon it now with all the doting tenderness of a mother gazing upon her firstborn. Such, I observed, is the power of association. "A lot went on here during the war," continued Mrs. Willett. "We used to have canning sessions in here twice each summer, soft fruit time, and then later with the apples and plums when they was ready. The WI used to bring the canning machine, and we spent all day up here. Had some fun, I can tell you." "I always bottled mine," said Mrs. Maugham, "much more wholesome." "Sometimes there'd be as many as 30 of us up here canning," continued Mrs. Willett, ignoring the interruption. "With the evacuees and that, some of 'em will be here this afternoon. You ask 'em, Miss Reed, about this hall in the war. Fairly hummed with life, it did. We had the clinic here, and the first aid classes, and no end of concerts and whist drives, and when we won the war we had a proper bean feast for the welcome home." "I suppose most of the evacuees had gone home by then," I said. "Nearly all," agreed Mrs. Willett sadly. "We missed 'em, you know. Never really wanted 'em to begin with, as you can guess, but somehow, sharing everything, we got fond of one another. And then Well, they was a larky lot, real mischieful, some of 'em. You couldn't help laughing. There was one. Her name was Mrs. Jarman. She'll be coming this afternoon. She was a caution. We all reckoned she was the larkiest of the lot. And I'll take my oath, said Mrs. Willett solemnly, turning earnestly toward me, that she was at the bottom of that Christmas pudding affair. The Christmas pudding affair? I echoed. It sounds like a detective story. Well, it was one that never got explained, said Mrs. Willett. I'll tell you what happened sometime. And she returned to her sandwich making. When our preparations were completed, we all trooped home to a midday meal and to exchange our pinafores and working attire for more elegant ensembles in honor of the visitors. Efficient and hard-working married women like Mrs. Willett returned to their kitchens to dish up such succulent dishes as beef casserole or steak and kidney pudding, which had been cooking themselves gently since 9 or 10 o'clock that morning. Scatterbrained spinsters like me, with no hungry husbands to consider, had a piece of cheese, 3 biscuits, and a cup of coffee, while they propped up their aching feet on a kitchen chair and read the paper. It was a good thing Amy couldn't see me, I thought, as I dusted the crumbs from my lap to the floor. This was letting myself go in a way which caused her such heartburning. Amy, my censorious college friend, when she lunches alone, sets one place at the dining-room table, complete with glass, side plate, table napkin, and so on, and eats her meal as decorously as any memsahib. And just think of the washing up, I said to Tibby, offering him a cheese rind. The disdainful creature took one sniff, flirted his tail, and walked away. Thousands of poor cats, I told him severely, retrieving the cheese rind for the birds, would give their eye teeth for a delicious piece of cheese rind like that. I tossed it through the open window. It was followed immediately by Tibby, who devoured it instantly, and I sipped my coffee, meditating on the maddening but absorbing ways of cats in general. At 10 to 2, we were all back in the hall awaiting the arrival of the coach. Our hair was freshly brushed, our noses powdered, our handkerchiefs sent out wafts of lavender water, or Chanel No. 5, according to taste and income. The sun had come out, the tea urns hissed merrily, rows of blue-banded teacups covered the trestle tables, and the air was filled with happy expectancy. When the coach drew up in the lane, the tea ladies rushed to the urns, and those with less responsibility surged out to meet the visitors. They were a cheerful crew, and dressed much more gaily than we country mice were. Little hats with eye veils, mauve coats and pink coats, stiletto heels, lots of patent leather, green and blue eyeshadow, flashing earrings, and above all, the high-pitched rapid twang of racy Cockney voices made us feel that a flock of some exotic birds had suddenly descended upon us, and that we were as drab and unremarkable as our Fairacre hedge sparrows. There were hugs and kisses and much bonhomie and badinage as they were ushered into the hall. Over their teacups the voices rose higher and higher. The noise was deafening. Carrying cups and saucers back and forth to the trestle table, I marveled at the snippets of conversation that came my way. Rosie got married last May, and they've got a lovely flat at Ruislip, so he's a computer. Our Janice, what was born here, you may remember. Well, a gentleman's got her a very good job for her up in West End, with the flat and all. Makes anything up to £60 a week, she does. Dad's retired now, of course, and all for buying a bungalow at Peachhaven, but I say, what's wrong with Hackney? Done us all right all these years, and you do see a bit of life. Mrs. Willett pointed out Mrs. Jarman to me. She was a tiny, bird-like woman with sparkling eyes. Her face was as wrinkled as an old apple, but her lips were a vivid orange, and her crepey eyelids were thick with blue eyeshadow. A tiny black velvet hat was lodged jauntily on her yellow hair, and a cigarette dangled between her fingers. She was telling a tale with great animation, her Fairacre audience registering half-shocked delight. She certainly looked a larky sort, as Mrs. Willett had described. She seemed to epitomize the very spirit of Cockney effervescence, and one could guess at her courage and example during the dark days of the war. As I watched her, Mrs. Pringle passed, bearing a tray. Mrs. Jarman's face lit up with devilment, and she called out some quip which was drowned in the general hubbub. It was not lost upon Mrs. Pringle, however, for that lady's face grew redder than ever, and an expression of deep disgust curved her mouth downward. She cast a look of outraged dignity toward the gay party and continued majestically with her tray. Mrs. Willett nudged me. "No love lost there," she hissed behind her hand. "There's no forgivin' and forgettin' about Mrs. P. They fair hates each other, she and Mrs. Jarman." Before long we all set out for a walk round Fairacre in the sunshine, and I had no chance to hear more. But when the massive tea was over, and the coach was packed again with visitors bearing daffodils and farm eggs, and hundreds of messages to those left behind in London, and Fairacre WI had cleaned up the debris, switched of the light, and locked the hall door, my chance came. Wearily, Mrs. Willett and I walked down the village together and paused by my gate. "No, I won't come in," Mrs. Willett said, shifting her basket from one arm to the other. "I've got some flower seeds to put in before it gets dark, but I just wanted to tell you about Mrs. Pringle and Mrs. Jarman, now you've seen 'em together." We propped ourselves amicably, one on each side of the schoolhouse gate. A clump of nearby narcissi sent up wafts of fragrance into the evening air, and Tivy rubbed himself round my tired legs as Mrs. Willett unfolded her tale of a wartime feud. Mrs. Jarman and her family arrived in Fairacre in the early summer of 1941. They had endured the air raids which had made their days and nights hideous from September 1940 onwards, sleeping most of the nights in a tube station and doing their best to carry on a normal life during the day. In May, however, their home was demolished, Mr. Jarman was killed, and Mrs. Jarman brought her 4 children to the comparative peace of Fairacre. The eldest, Clifford, was 15, a tousle-headed lad whose rubbery lips seemed constantly glued to a mouth organ. Doreen, known as Doreen, was 12, already ogled the boys, and was affronted when she was made to wash off her lipstick at Fairacre School. Nigel, 2 years younger, spent his time machine gunning with outstretched fingers, and Gloria, age 6, was the baby. All 4 had their mother's blonde hair, but none had quite the vivacity of that irrepressible widow. The family was billeted in the cottage next door to Mrs. Pringle. It was owned by an elderly woman, now dead, called Jane Morgan. Mrs. Morgan's husband, like his neighbor Fred Pringle, was serving overseas. Mrs. Morgan looked upon the Jarman family as the price one has to pay in wartime, and was unhappy about their presence, but resigned to it. Mrs. Jarman, for her part, thought Jane Morgan a stuffy old party, dead from the neck up, but never meanin' no harm. They shook down together fairly well. It was Mrs. Pringle, of course, who really caused the trouble. Her evacuees were an elderly couple who did for themselves in one room of her house. They were a self-effacing pair and were careful to give no cause for annoyance. They crept in and out like mice, giving scared little smiles to their formidable landlady, and offering her such small tributes as clothing coupons or morsels of margarine in order to keep her sweet, as Mrs. Jarman said. Before long, the Jarman children fell foul of Mrs. Pringle. It was their habit to retire to the end of the garden, climb upon the roof of the empty pigsty, and there watch the activities of their next-door neighbor. They had a foreign Cockney impudence which Mrs. Pringle abhorred. Village children might have called names or even thrown a clod or 2 of earth over the hedge. The Jarman children were much more subtle. "You ever seen anyone who's as broad as she's high?" one of them would shout to the next. The result would be tempestuous giggles on one side of the hedge and much bridling on the other. The children watched their neighbor pegging out voluminous nether garments on the line and made rude comments to each other in voices calculated to carry well. "Never knew Fairacre'd got a barrage balloon, did you?" and so on. To give Mrs. Jarman her due, she corrected the children whenever she found them at fault, administering a brisk cuff or letting fly with a vocabulary as lively as their own, but she needed to work long hours charring at various large houses in the neighborhood, and the children had a good deal of time on their own. Mrs. Pringle brought matters to a head one day by making a formal call next door to complain. She had donned a hat and gloves to add more dignity to the occasion, and registered majestic disapproval from the cherries nodding on her brim to the steel tips on her wartime heels. Mrs. Jarman, just home from work, frying chips on an oil stove and enduring the clamor of 4 hungry children around her, was not in any mood to be conciliatory. "What did you say to Mrs. Pringle?" she demanded of her innocent-eyed offspring. "Never said nothin'," said Doreen glibly. "Never said a word," quoth the 2 younger ones, raising limpid blue eyes to their mother. Mrs. Jarman, brandishing a fish slice, turned to the massive figure in the doorway. "That's your answer," she said flatly. "My kids don't tell lies. Take yourself off." Mrs. Pringle drew in a long, outraged breath. "They not only tell lies, they're rude, pert little monkeys, and if they was mine, they'd get a jolly good hidin' for it." "Say that again," yelled Mrs. Jarman, advancing menacingly, much to the delight of the juvenile onlookers. Mrs. Pringle took a step or 2 backward, but did not retreat completely. "Not that they'd had any chance," boomed the lady, "as anyone with half an eye can see looking at you. But if I has any more of their old buck, Mrs. Jarman, I shall go to the police, and the Caxley police at that." Mrs. Jarman, eyes blazing, now rushed upon her neighbor and would have dragged the fruit-laden hat and the hair beneath it from her adversary's head. But Mrs. Pringle, with a dexterity surprising for one of her bulk, nipped smartly down the garden path and put the gate between them. Mrs. Jarman's furious shrieks, punctuated by Mrs. Pringle's booms, caused several curtains to twitch in neighboring windows. Mrs. Pringle had just managed to shout something about East End scum above the din when the 4 children, who had been watching the fun from their doorstep, screamed in unison, "Fat's on fire! Mom, the fat's on fire!" And this diversion brought the ladies' immediate hostilities to a close. From then on, a state of constant warfare existed between Mrs. Pringle and the Jarman family. If the children's ball went over the hedge, Mrs. Pringle impounded it with smug satisfaction. When Mrs. Pringle's tea towel blew off her line into the next-door garden, it ended up flying like a flag from the topmost branch of the Jarman's greengage tree, a position from which the gale was not responsible, despite the assurances of the children. "We can't reach that, Mrs. Pringle," they said with mock regret and dancing eyes. "Ain't it a shame? Must have blowed there in the wind, see?" And there it fluttered for several weeks before being ripped to pieces by the elements and an inquisitive pair of jackdaws who used strips for the adornment of their nest. The 2 women never let the opportunity of a verbal brush pass without making full use of it. In a way, each enjoyed the situation. They were well matched. Mrs. Jarman might be quicker and more prolific of vocabulary, but Mrs. Pringle had a native malice and an incalculable capacity for taking umbrage, which stood her in good stead. She moved like a tank into battle, heavy, slow, and apparently indestructible. But now and again a burst of deadly fire came from that implacable front to score a hit upon Mrs. Jarman, the resilient sniper. One Saturday, a jumble sale was arranged in Fairacre. It was to take place, as always, in the village hall, and on the morning of the day in question, a few women went there to set up the tables and sort the jumble into the time-honored categories of men's, women's, children's, hats and shoes, and general junk. Mrs. Pringle set out laden with a large bundle. All was held together with a faded mackintosh tied securely round the bulk by the sleeves. Mrs. Jarman watched her struggle up the road in a high wind before collecting her own parcel and setting forth. "Don't want to catch up with that old tartar," she said to Doreen, who was dreamily picking at the flaking paint of the mantel shelf. "And give over that lark, will you?" she added ferociously, giving the girl a swift box on the ear. "Don't forget," she continued as she whirled about the room for her possessions. "Spuds on at 11, 2 large whites from the baker. Tell the milkman it's 6 and 4pence and none of his old buck. Keep the cat off the custard and expect me when you see me." The door slammed behind her, and despite her desire to let Mrs. Pringle arrive first, she found herself entering the narrow doorway with her. Mrs. Pringle drew aside with marked distaste. "Don't mind me breathing the same air, I hope," commented Mrs. Jarman tartly, pushing in first. Mrs. Pringle maintained an affronted silence. About half a dozen women were already at work sorting a mountain of assorted garments on the floor. Back and forth hurried another 2, taking the articles to the right table. Mrs. Pringle, by ancient custom, was given charge of general junk, As Mrs. Jarman had never been forgiven for saying on an early occasion, "It seemed just right somehow to see Mrs. P standing by that label." Hers was a comparatively simple task. Saucepans, chipped vases, lidless casseroles, faded pictures, lopsided toast racks, stone hot water bottles, riding boots stuffed with beautiful boxwood trees, archaic lawn mowers, and many unidentifiable objects found their way to Mrs. Pringle's table. Sometimes large pieces of ancient furniture flanked her counter: washstands, fire guards, sagging wicker armchairs, and dilapidated bamboo tables. Once there was the ugliest three-piece suite in Christendom among general junk. Competition for this had been fierce, as well I knew, for on that occasion I had been Mrs. Pringle's feeble assistant, and had watched her masterly handling of the sale. It had gone eventually for £2 to Mrs. Fowler of Tyler's Row. She was going to present it to her mother in Caxley, and I must say I felt the greatest sympathy for that unsuspecting old lady. Now Mrs. Pringle deposited her mackintoshed bundle with the other clothes and made her way to her stall. Mrs. Jarman fell on her knees with the other sorters and began to work with spirit. "Lor!" she cried, holding up a moth-eaten moleskin waistcoat. "Who'd buy this stuff? Talk about Granny's little old skin rug. Gives you the creeps, don't it?" "My husband's," said one of the helpers shortly. Mrs. Jarman seemed not a whit abashed. She began rummaging in the bundle which Mrs. Pringle had brought, making disparaging comments on her discoveries, much to the embarrassment of the Fairacre women, who knew full well how important it was to guard one's tongue on such occasions. "Look at this!" cried Mrs. Jarman. "3 shirts and never a button among 'em. Who's pinched the buttons, eh?" Mrs. Pringle, wreathed in seagrass from the unraveling footstool she was carrying, paused by the group and replied loftily, "I took the trouble to remove those shirt buttons. They'll do for another day." "How's that for meanness?" commented Mrs. Jarman, twinkling at the others. "The poor chap who buys this will have to go about with his shirt flapping, I suppose." "Some people," began Mrs. Pringle, "knows their duty to their country in wartime, and saves every possible penny, not like some I could mention, not 100 miles from here, as buys pineapple chunks when there's rhubarb in the garden." This sideswipe merely had the effect of bringing Mrs. Jarman's usual high spirits to the boiling point. Her blue eyes flashed with the joy of battle joined. The onlookers were half fearful and half delighted to see Mrs. Pringle in combat with such a worthy adversary. And we'll learn about the combat next time.